Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. The Ukrainian crisis rolls on. I will direct, if I may, your kind attention to my website, tarpley.net, where by the time you hear this broadcast, we will have posted a major essay by me on the history of Ukraine. I'll try to give you some more samples of that towards the end of this program, if we can eke out the time from the busy world theater going on around us. But the principal insights that would be added to what we already had last week come from John Wheeler Bennett, British agent, in some ways the central figure of the network that produced Henry Kissinger later on. But his book, The Forgotten Peace, Brest-Litovsk, 1918, a discussion of what was actually going on in Eastern Europe, European Russia, during 1918-1919, the time when we had the first appearance of Ukraine, the first time Ukraine ever got on the map, the first time that Ukraine during 1919 was self-governing. And, of course, we had pogroms. We had this Simon Petliura starting with his massacres of Jews and others, but also Poles, and tremendous hostility to Russians. So do take a look. In the past week, we've been hearing again this idiotic, imbecilic mantra of NATO and U.S. propaganda. There are no fascists in Ukraine. There are no fascists in the Ukrainian government. We heard that again this morning on National Public Radio on the Diane Rehm weekly international hour. No fascists? Well, right sector would beg to differ. Those right sector fascists, neo-Nazis or Nazis, paleo-Nazis, some of them, they are in a furor after the killing of the Nazi thug Muzichko, or Muzichka, and what they had this past weekend and into this week, the Kiev Rada, the parliament, self-styled, was surrounded by fascist gangs attempting to impose the ouster of the interior minister, blamed by the right sector, by Yarosh and his gang, for having killed their man Muzichka. So we had those fascists on parade. They were all over the place. They were holding the parliament at gunpoint, as they did finally in the late months of Yanukovych. Although this time there are no police left. There's no Berkut. There's nothing left to try to stop them. So there are plenty of fascists. No threats? Well, there are no threats to the Russian minority or the Russian population of eastern Ukraine. Why do we have Timoshenko, the kleptocratic gas princess and darling of NATO and great friend of Merkel? Why is Timoshenko threatening to use nuclear weapons for genocide and ethnic cleansing against the Russians of East Ukraine? How can that be? And not a word about it, of course, from the NATO media. So there's plenty wrong. I would urge the following. Rather than go down the path of the warmongers, as we heard on National Public Radio this morning, National Pentagon Radio, with the BBC, interestingly, the British have come into their own, right? That hostility, that implacable conflict between the Russian Empire, the British Empire in the 19th century is still alive culturally. It's a tropism. It's a Pavlovian reaction. I would propose to anybody of goodwill in the world, and in particular to people in the United States who can influence to some degree the political events here, you need to support, in a general sense, what Putin is doing. It doesn't mean you have to support every piece of idiocy that comes out of the mouth of some dubious character on some allegedly Russian television network. No, you don't have to support every piece of imbecility from Abby Martin. It doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that the general nature of the project is beneficial for the world. What are the benefits of Putin in the general sense? First of all, we have seen since 1991 that the unipolar world is not viable. It's not workable. This is not ideology. This is simply a practical observation. The problem is that the ruling elite of the United States lacks the necessary wisdom. There was some wisdom during the Cold War. It was induced by big, dirty Soviet ICBMs and H-bombs. But since that threat has receded, at least in the minds of these characters, the worst possible tendencies of the U.S. ruling class have come to the fore. They have been elicited. They have been evoked by this unipolar situation. I don't know anybody in the world that would have done better if you had the Chinese elite, or for that matter, the Russian elite, or German, or whatever, Japanese, it doesn't matter, Brazil. Any elite put in this unipolar position is going to witness its own worst tendencies become dominant, or at least strive and contend for domination. But in the case of the United States, concretely, what we've lived through now in the past quarter century is that without the counterbalancing force of the USSR, and with Russia in a position of weakness and having lost the initiative, the worst tendencies have come out in the U.S. And these are the neocons, on the one hand, the right-wing warmongers, the pro-Israeli faction of the United States, but not only that, right, the ones who want to follow the Nazi recipe, really, of Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, that conflict is needed, the Nietzschean recipe, I guess you'd say. The Nietzschean Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss faction here in the United States, wishing to organize everything around enemy image, Feindbild, and therefore to run this society on an oligarchical basis using the pretext of this foreign enemy. And we've also had on the other side the left warmongers. We've seen them more clearly in the past couple of years since Obama came in. As I warned, the left warmongers for Obama, the way they see it, the human rights people, the humanitarian interventionists, the lunatics like Samantha Power, the loopy crackpot speaking for the United States at the United Nations. These two mentally deranged groups in their own geopolitical estimations, right? You got the neocons and then the responsibility to protect people, the R2P group. Between them, we see that the worst tendencies of the entire ideological spectrum come to the fore. What is needed is the traditional recipe, the balance of power, a counterweight. Who can provide the counterweight? Who has the political maturity, a certain amount of economic power, a certain amount of economic independence, a certain amount of cultural tradition? It's Russia. It's the unconquered country, right? Remember, the unconquered countries, the ones who have not been overrun in the last 1,000 years or so, or, well, not quite 1,000 years, but let's say 500 years, or thereabouts anyway. It gets you down to the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. These are special countries in that regard. We need the power of Russia to be revived. A strong Russia is a great help for a striking worker in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with what you hear about on the radio here at tarpley.net, tarpley.net, and that includes this article on the minimal, feeble basis of Ukrainian nationality. The fact that Ukraine is a puppet state set up by the German General Staff, by Field Marshal von Hindenburg and General Ludendorff during World War I for the purposes of getting food. It is the delicatessen of the German General Staff, the supermarket of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, a supermarket chain, 1 million tons of grain, 400 million eggs, 50,000 tons of beef, and so forth. This was the price of recognition of the Ukrainian Rada, February 1918. Now, getting back to the Putin question, first of all, the need to balance the United States, to suppress and to muffle these awful atavistic tendencies. In other words, the atavism is here. The neocons have essentially shaken the foundations of the modern world, and then they're joined by the responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention, cement the power crackpots. The benchmark is the United Nations Charter. Interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states is inadmissible. Force and the threat of force are inadmissible. And then we had the Non-Proliferation Treaty. United States nuclear state cannot, under the nuclear non-proliferation, go around threatening non-nuclear states. Once you do that, you've knocked the entire world out of kilter. So Putin is the sole effective antidote to that. We need Putin to remain resolute because this suppresses these awful heteronomic and catastrophic tendencies of the U.S. Now, a second point is in the very specifics of the Ukrainian situation. We do not want a rebirth of fascism. Speaking of atavisms, the return of fascism and Nazism and anti-Semitism and racism and Sturmabteilung, right, the brown shirts of the Muzichko type, the right sector group, but also Svoboda, and everything that they represent culturally and politically. This must be nipped in the bud. Ukrainian fascism must be strangled in the cradle. Principiis obsta, right? Während den Anfängen. That was the sad lesson for Germany after the seizure of power in 1933. You've got to nip this in the bud because all of a sudden, like the September 1930 elections in Germany, right? The Nazis went from being kind of a nuisance and a curiosity to being a real threat to seize power. So we want the Ukrainian fascists crushed, quite simply, right? We want them to be deprived of the ability to influence world affairs. We don't want the ability to unleash World War III in the hands of some lunatic of the Chanibok Yarosh model. And I mentioned them as the head of Svoboda and the head of the right sector, respectively. We cannot have these people affecting and impacting the destiny of the world. And then, just to make this accounting a little bit simpler than it might be, a third point is the one that's posed to every individual, and that is to say the human qualities, the moral and intellectual qualities of the U.S. ruling elite, and how degenerate they are, and how decadent they are, and how hysterical, and how they are the ones who have turned their backs on reality as a matter of philosophical method, right? Remember, they are in the Nietzschean Schopenhauer realm. They believe in the world as will and imagination. You make your own world by your own purely gratuitous and heteronomic or existential actions. Take, for example, we compare Obama and Putin, and we see who is morally and intellectually superior. I don't think there's any doubt. Again, I'm not in the business of demonizing Obama. I tried to warn against Obama when there was time to prevent him from being inflicted on the world. But now that train has left the station, and at the moment, in the face of the Romney forces, the madmen of the type of the neocons, the Kagans, the Seniors, the Josephs, and so on, the Krauthammers, so on down the line, those guys are worse than Obama right now. Obama has been to some degree, domesticated by the powers of the presidency. In other words, the system designed by John Adams on the basis of Machiavelli has essentially made Obama into, if not a break, at least a kind of a passive lump on the path to war. Right? He's not pushing it. The push is coming from elsewhere. The Republican Party has dropped all pretense of libertarianism. They are on the road as a warmonger party once again. Did the Republicans fool you? They didn't fool me. Did Rand Paul fool you? No. The closer they get to power, or they think they're getting to power, the more warmonger they are. That is a fool's errand. Anybody who believes that garbage. And you saw at the beginning of this crisis, little Rand Paul making some noises, oh, let's not overdo it. And then as he saw that his Republican lunatic base were showing their true warmonger colors, right? Marijuana and war is now the winning libertarian formula. Well, then little Rand began running. He began to get his helmet and his bayonet and his Confederate flag or whatever he has, and marching off to the Ukraine. So that's a bad situation. So Obama's not the worst. But when we compare Obama to Putin, it's clear that from a human, moral, intellectual point of view, Putin is superior. There's no doubt about it. Let's take another one. Let's compare Kerry, the blasé, skull and bones, rich boy who gambles with other people's lives, other people's money. I think I've told the story about his crash in Bretagne, in Brittany, France, in the mid-'60s in the summer, accompanied by a guy that I knew from high school, and how he almost ended his career right there, right, driving way too fast. And then there's another story about him going under the Golden Gate Bridge in an airplane, accompanied by the later U.S. ambassador to Italy. As we have the famous quotation from F. Scott Fitzgerald talking to Ernest Hemingway, the rich are not like us, Ernie. And Ernie doesn't get it. Ernie is quite dumb compared to Scott. Ernie says, yeah, they have more money. And Scott says, no, it's much more than just that. It's a whole cultural mindset. So, in that sense, it's clear. Lavrov, as an intellectual, as a person of courage and resources, is humanly superior to Kerry. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So once again, the benefits of Putin and why you should resist the Russophobic hysteria engulfing the United States. You need a balance. You need a counterweight to suppress the warmonger lunatic tendencies in the U.S. elite, be they neocons or the humanitarian interventionists. Secondly, it is in the interest of the world for this rebirth of fascism to be crushed, to be neutralized, liquidated, whatever it is. Remember that when General Badoglio turned to the king and said 5 minutes of gunfire, fascism is over. Think about what that would have meant. No march on Rome, no Mussolini, no fascism means no Nazism, no Hitler, no World War II. So in terms of historical morality, would Badoglio have been on the right side of the angels if the 5 minutes of gunfire had dispersed the ragamuffin gutter snipe legions of Il Duce, who was hiding near the Swiss border at the time? I think you can see, in terms of the historical potentials involved, it's an interesting proposition. Anyway, Obama inferior to Putin, Kerry inferior to Lavrov, and then let's even take, let's go to the UN. Let's compare Churkin, Vitaly Churkin, the Russian delegate, to our dear loopy Samantha Power. Now, I've criticized Churkin. He has not been an Adlai Stevenson at the Cuban Missile Crisis. He could have brought the tapes, the various tapes. He could have brought the Newland tape in there and played it. He could have brought the Estonian foreign minister in there, talking to Madame Ashton, Baroness Ashton, about how the anti-Yanukovych forces were sponsoring the snipers. There's an attempt to deny that now, but the world knows. He could have done something similar to Adlai Stevenson, bringing in the photographs of the U.S., the surveillance photos of the Soviet missiles in Cuba in October of 1962. Didn't do that, but still, you compare him to the loopy, crackpot Samantha Power with her self-righteous, hysterical posturing, all the while sporting that ravaged look. We don't want to speculate here on the family program about what that ravaged look might have been caused by, but you get the idea. Churkin is a normal, functionary diplomat making the case for his country as best he can. I would say it's too narrow, it's too formalistic, but still, you compare him, Samantha Power's a raving lunatic. So if you don't like these sociopathic tendencies coming to the fore in the U.S. elite, then the only conceivable antidote is Putin. Now, Putin, however, falls short in certain areas. It doesn't mean that you're giving him a 100% endorsement. Let me just point out, we have this interesting campaign. I have two documents that go in this direction. First of all, we have Anne Applebaum, and if you're a regular listener, you know that Anne Applebaum is Madame Sikorsky. She's married. She's given up telling you this in every column now, but Anne Applebaum is the wife of the Polish Foreign Minister Sikorsky, who is one of the signatories of the February 21st deal that was supposed to cool the Kiev situation, right? The Maidan was supposed to go home, and elections were scheduled, and that was signed by Fabius of France, Steinmeier of Germany, and Sikorsky of Poland. And this is Madame Sikorsky writing to us here, Washington Post, Sunday, March 30th. Russia's anti-Western thinking takes hold. So somehow she's talking to a lawyer from Georgetown who has a shtick about LGBT, and somehow from Georgia, which is an enemy of Russia, she manages to generalize that the entire Russian Federation is mobilized against LGBT and homosexuals. And she also goes through the various right-wing groups, Jobbik of Hungary, Marine Le Pen, who just Marine Le Pen had a very limited, shabby success. She got 15 cities of the lower middle rank, couldn't take Paris, couldn't take Marseille, couldn't take Lyon. Not so great. But anyway, you get the idea that there's this awful tide of cultural backlash against the Anglo-American world, and somehow Putin is to be associated with that. But now, even more interesting, far more so, Masha Gessen on Monday, March 31st, the day after, and writing from the same printout, Masha Gessen goes back, and I think for the first time, reports to the benighted readers of the Washington Post that Putin gave a speech in December where he pointed out that Russia does not claim a global or regional hegemony, but will strive to be leaders of a certain current of opinion, and therefore presumably a block of countries in the world in an informal sense, right? Not the Warsaw Pact, but a bunch of countries that tend to converge on practical points. So Putin says, and I'm going to read you these because this is the first time these quotes have ever been in the Washington Post. So Russia should be a world leader. This is, now quoting from Putin, quote, "This is absolutely objective and understandable for a state like Russia with its great history and culture, with many centuries of experience, not of so-called tolerance, neutered and barren, but of the real organic life of different peoples existing together within the framework of a single state." Now, somehow, this Masha Gessen of the, well, he's a biographer of Putin, I guess. He's a professional Putinophobe, that somehow this is code word for LGBT. I'm not sure I see it. And then he goes on. Today, many nations are revising their moral values and ethical norms. eroding ethnic traditions and differences between peoples and cultures. Society is now required not only to recognize everyone's right to the freedom of conscience. I think it's wrong in the text, but I think he's talking about freedom of conscience, meaning of religion, political views, and privacy. But, says Putin, you're also supposed to accept without question the equality of good and evil. Strange as it seems, concepts that are opposite in meaning. Well, the Anglo-American cultural synthesis of Anglo-American liberalism in the most general sense, left-wing liberals, right-wing liberals, reactionaries, but all liberals. What is the basis of this? Two things, I think. The first is that financiers ought to rule the world. That compared to anybody else, generals, bureaucrats, demagogues, priests, whatever it is, that the best ruling class you can get, according to the Anglo-American liberal, is a banker. And therefore they think Soros should rule the world, and oligarchs and whatever. In other words, the whole British system, the Venetian Constitution, as Benjamin Disraeli put it. Okay, and the second point of liberalism is there are no objective criteria of good and evil. That is wrong. I can derive objective good and evil and objective human rights out of the needs of production, economic growth, scientific, technological, and industrial progress. All of those dictate a high regard for the individual, for longevity, for education, for a personal sphere of rights, and so forth. And those are objective. They are not simply bleeding heart labels or wishes tacked on to a historical process that's going somewhere else. My categories of good and evil are rooted in production, economic life, and the needs thereof. So, Masha Gelman thinks that Putin is trying to marshal the anti-Western forces of the globe. Well, you want to do that, you better have an alternative to economic globalization. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So if Putin, responding here to Masha Gelman in the Washington Post, Monday, March 31st, if Putin is supposed to be the leader of an anti-Western bloc of states, the leader of the anti-Western world, the elementary necessity, which still has to be addressed, is an alternate monetary system, an alternative to economic globalization. Now here, the Chinese, unfortunately, have perhaps don't have the clarity either. You might look to them to solve this, right? You'd say, well, the anti-Western bloc of states, in a sense of an alternative to the failed leadership of the Anglo-American elite and the failure of their neoliberal ideas, would be the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and some others around that, Iran coming in, and so forth. But in order to do that, you've got to have an idea of a new world monetary system. And unfortunately, despite what Medvedev thought, it's not enough to make a little coin. You've got to have markets. You've got to have treasury bond markets that routinely do $1 trillion a day and can handle anything up to $4 to $5 trillion in a day, if you want to have the breadth and depth to have a reserve currency. Where's your reserve currency? And the other thing I would say is the BRICS Bank. Remember, they were supposed to be this alternative to the World Bank International Monetary Fund called the BRICS Bank. We haven't heard from them. Are they going to act on Egypt, for example? Egypt has been bailed out by Saudi Arabia for the moment, but how long will that last? How long will the Saudi regime last? And then other countries, right? If you had Ukraine and you wanted to stabilize Ukraine or even Crimea, you're going to need an investment program, a Marshall Plan. Marshall Plans will not come from the IMF, nor will they come from the World Bank or the International Finance Association, of anything of that sort. So if Putin wants to be, and I hope he has some concept in this direction, the leader of an anti-Western bloc, it's going to take a decisive break with neoliberal economics, economic globalization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. Unfortunately, given the power of the pro-Medvedev faction inside Russia, the entire direction of Russian policy of the last several years, anyway, until only yesterday, has been to join, to become integrated into that world system. So now you're talking about, hopefully, a reversal of that direction towards an alternative. The world needs an alternative, and an alternative certainly could come from the BRICS, but it's going to require a much greater programmatic power and thrust than we've seen so far. And obviously, we applaud what Putin has done so far. He has obviously accomplished a lot with means that are not super abundant. He's done much with little. The great commanders often do it this way. Let me just go back to Masha Gelman and one or two other points. The idea here is that Putin is leading a bloc which is interesting. And he says, here's Putin again, I'm going to quote him, "We know that there are more and more people in the world who support our position on defending traditional values. Russia's role is to prevent movement backward and downward into chaotic darkness and a return to a primitive state." That is very, very germane. The chaotic darkness and the primitive state are essentially the new dark age that is conjured up by this program of destroying the nation states, right, which is the CIA, State Department, NATO program, and the creation of microstates, mini-states, failed states, rump states, chaos, warlords. You've seen it from Iraq to Libya to Sudan to Kosovo, now Scotland, now Ukraine. They did it. And therefore, the problem is with Masha Gelman. Masha Gelman can only understand this in terms of sexual identity. This is a key to the impoverishment of the Anglo-American or Western spirit, that they can't imagine traditional values as being anything but homophobia. Wait a minute. How about some other traditional values? How about a traditional value that there is right and wrong? How about a traditional value that the nation state is a good thing and it's better to be patriotic and support your country in a constructive way, not as a jingo, but as a country. Each country undoubtedly has something unique to contribute to human development. There are very few exceptions. And therefore, that would be a traditional value. Or the implementation of science, technology, and industry can improve the human condition. Traditional value. So it's broader than just LGBT. Anyway, this is obviously a campaign, right? When you get Madame Sikorsky-Applebaum on Sunday and Masha Gelman on Monday with the same printout, that's a campaign, and this is one of the reasons why we should be willing to counter it. Now, looking a little bit further here, we had last week this infamous telephone call by Davutoglu. It's some kind of a Turkish government conference call or meeting or something of this sort, where Davutoglu and one of the leading Turkish spooks says, we can send 4 men into Syria, get them to fire rockets at Turkey, and then we'll have the pretext for war, which Recep Erdogan, lightheaded Recep, is looking for, right? So this is very serious, needless to say. They're talking about arranging a false flag, right? We had this in the Downing Street memorandum of Tony Blair and Mad Dog Bush the Younger. Now we've got it again. But remember, if you're listening to all of this from a NATO country, they're playing with your future. Turkey has been in NATO from the very beginning. You can't do that, Davutoglu. We got you dead to rights. Now, Erdogan has said, well, he wants to shut down Twitter, he wants to shut down Facebook because they're telling that he's corrupt. Yeah, corrupt. I'm sure he's corrupt. But that's an internal matter. Once you get to this false flag, warmonger, Sarajevo trigger, there's a new Sarajevo right there, just a little bit further southeast, right? As Bismarck said, Don't get a world war going based on some stupid thing in the Balkans. Well, don't get it on some stupid thing in Anatolia or the Levant either. So the U.S. media, silent as a tomb. They say, he's accused of being corrupt. And then one of them, I think France 24, says, then he's accused of doing something with a meeting of that Twitter is accused of reporting the contents of a secret government meeting. But they don't tell you what it was, even though the French would be dragged in under the failed leadership of Hollande as much as anybody else. Now, Davutoglu is doubling down. He is escalating. He is not chastened. He has learned nothing. So we have this strange issue, which is not well known. It is the tomb of Suleiman Shah, S-H-A-H. So Suleiman Shah is the father of Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, right? Osmanisches Reich. So Osman I has his father, Suleiman Shah, but the tomb of Suleiman Shah is in Syria. It is an exclave from the Turkish point of view. From the point of view of Syria, it's an enclave, and then alleged, right? Because the exact legal status of this is, well, anybody's guess. But the idea is that Turkey has declared unilaterally, I think is the overwhelming case. Turkey has said to Syria, watch out, the tomb of Suleiman Shah, even though it's located in your big city of Aleppo, we consider that sovereign territory of Turkey. And now we get our warmonger friend Davutoglu saying Turkey will respond if Syria does anything to disturb the tomb of Suleiman Shah, or if Al-Qaeda does, or if anybody does. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. In these days, we're marking 65 years of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Atlantic Alliance, 1949, Dean Acheson. And 15 years since the bombing of Serbia, that colossal act of historical vandalism by NATO, blowing up the bridges over the Danube. And, of course, Amanpour and our dear friend Lupi Samantha Power were a key part of that, right? The myth of the 100,000 dead Kosovars that was dished up by Amanpour and dear Lupi, Mrs. Cass Sunstein, alias Samantha Power. NATO has morphed into something ugly. At the beginning, you could make a case for it in the 50s. There was the Red Army. There were nuclear weapons there in the Soviet Union, and they were a few miles from the main cities of Germany in particular. The Fulda Gap, the Ljubljana Gap, all of these areas were real. But it's when you get the NATO out-of-area deployments, right? Remember, the slogan in the 80s was out of area or out of business. In other words, that NATO would wither on the vine, as it should have, unless it could become something for the Malvinas, Falklands, for the areas like Afghanistan, which have no part of the original purview of the NATO alliance. The U.S. had insisted on a restricted definition of where NATO applied, so the U.S. didn't want to get dragged into colonial wars, say, by the French in Indochina or by the British somewhere or the Portuguese or any of the other NATO members. But now we can see the reductio ad absurdum of all this. What can we say to Davutoglu when he says that he, and this is amazing, he's playing with your life. The posturing Davutoglu, trying to detract attention from his taped conversations where he's setting up a false flag. Davutoglu vowed to respond to attacks against the tomb of Suleiman Shah as it would against any other part of Turkish soil. When a missile is launched into Turkey by the Syrian regime, or by the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or Sham and Levant, Iraq and Sham, or any other element, we will act equally in return. So he's basically saying, you, Western Europe, you, U.S., you, Canada, you're all my auxiliaries because I'm going to go on this lunatic provocateur policy. Now, this is unfortunate because Turkey was a key part of NATO from the very beginning, but with this kind of stuff, this is going to have to be shut down now. We cannot once again have petty, tin pot, demagogue, militarists, warmongers, racists, fascists, be they in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or in Poland, or in Turkey, or any of these frontline states, if they want to call themselves that. We can't have this. We can't be dragged into war by these lunatics, right? And, of course, the politics of these countries are anybody's guess. Now, let's consider some of our other interesting topics. Let's look at the internal U.S. situation now, first of all. Let's look at U.S. domestic economics. The John Birch Society is riding high because we've got the Ryan budget. We've got Paul Ryan, reactionary Republican with fascistoid overtones, remember Romney's running mate, who has proposed his stinkburger budget. That's Obama's term. It's a good term, a stinkburger. Why not? This is the way the Republicans used to talk about the stimulus, the blankety-blank sandwich. All right, the stinkburger. And it is scandalous. So here's the idea. Paul Ryan wants to do the following. This is now genocidal austerity, and let me prepare you. You're going to hear a bill of indictment for high crimes against humanity under the Nuremberg Code that make Paul Ryan a Class A war criminal. The budget plan, first of all, is going to gouge Medicaid. Medicaid is going to be block granted. It's going to, in other words, it's going to be turned over to the wonderful states like Snyder of Michigan, Kasich of Ohio, Scott of Florida, and other raving reactionaries. It's going to be turned over to them, and it's going to be capped, so it cannot grow. So they're planning to save $125 billion by block granting Medicaid, turning it over to the states. They're going to gouge food stamps. Now, we had food stamps were gouged already last November. Food stamps are being gouged now, at least stupid Boehner tried to gouge them, although he apparently didn't know how to write the bill. He's so inept and dumb, John of Orange. So they wanted to cut food stamps a second time. It didn't work. Now they're going to come back and cut them a third time. I wonder if they're going to reach the 63% cut in food stamp spending that was the presidential program of the leprechaun, little Ron Paul, back in the fall of 2011. That, of course, would mean, as I said at the time, pellagra, rickets, scurvy, beriberi, from pellagra Paul. So we've got little Rand. We'll find a vitamin deficiency disease that he's going to bring about. So this is what Ryan is competing with. It's highly relevant. So Medicare, if you're on Medicare, gets set to be gouged. It's going to be called premium support. Premium support means you get a voucher. It means instead of having a guaranteed benefit, that is to say Medicare will pay 80% of any and all approved procedures, you're going to get a voucher that says this is worth X dollars, and then you're on your own. And then, I have the wonderful privilege of choosing. I can freedom to choose among different paths to the mortuary. That's great. But that's how this stuff is sold, right? The stupid American ideology. I want freedom to choose, even if it means that I take all the risk and I'm on my own. So the premium support voucher, that's going to be it. Military spending goes up by $483 billion. Non-defense discretionary domestic programs goes down by $800 billion. Ryan, of course, repeals Obamacare except for the worst part of Obamacare. That he keeps. The cuts of Medicare, the money taken out of Medicare to support the rest of the program, which, as you see, he's not even siphoning into Medicaid. He's siphoning it into military spending. He wants workfare, slave labor programs for welfare recipients. Of course, there is no more welfare. The vote on this is supposed to be today, and it is the definition of class warfare, as Van Hollen says. But Van Hollen, you're not capable of class defense because you're not a class-based thinker. You're just playing word games. It turns out that the reactionary Republican tax expert Dave Camp is quitting. I hope that means that his monstrous program is going to go with him into that good night. We know that Ryan is emerging as this ideologue of opposition to the various Great Society anti-poverty programs. He's got strong racist overtones, and he's claiming to balance the budget by 2024, I believe, although his figures do not add up. He's got voodoo economics because he's saying, well, there's going to be such a surge of wonderful economic growth thanks to my program. The centerpiece, of course, tax cuts for the rich. Tax cuts for the rich. A top individual tax rate of 25%. Now, the demonization of the Koch brothers would be a matter of some public utility. Yes, indeed. We'll get to that in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So the reactionary Republicans, at least according to the schedule, today, Friday, the 4th of April, were supposed to be attempting to ram through this genocidal austerity budget built according to the criteria of the John Birch Society alumnus Paul Ryan and his racist wife, coming from a family associated with the George Wallace racist movement. And nobody brought that up when he started quoting Charles Murray in the bell curve or whatever it was. The Koch brothers are, generally speaking, behind this, right? Koch, the second largest privately held corporation in the United States. Koch and Koch, the two brothers, are in the top 10 in the world, I think, up there with Carlos Slim and Bill Gates and what have you. So Harry Reid has been attacking the Koch brothers, and I think this is an interesting initiative. Dingy Harry, of course, not my cup of tea, but still, a little bit of fighting could be a good thing. Demonizing the Koch brothers, allegedly, well, they are one of the centers of evil in this world, and they're hundreds of millions of dollars under Citizens United and now under the latest monstrosity from the Rats Cabal, right? Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia. The Rats Cabal has put through the Supreme Court the idea that there can be no cap on contributions by plutocrats and predators to political candidates during the 2-year federal congressional election cycle. You can give to any of them, you can give to all of them, although it's still $2,600 per candidate. But now we have the self-righteous breastbeating of, I think it's Charles Koch. Yes, it's Charles Koch, who writes a letter to the Wall Street Journal of yesterday, celebrated, of course, by Limp Paw on the air. April 2nd, Charles G. Koch. Charles Koch, I'm fighting to restore a free society. And he says, instead of welcoming free debate, collectivists engage in character assassination. Oh, the pot calling the kettle black. From what a pulpit do we hear this? This is somebody who has put hundreds of millions of dollars into attack ads, which are based on pure character assassination, lies, innuendos, distortions, omissions, and other mass dumbing down measures. So he's for freedom. He's for the freedom agenda. He's trying to understand the principles that enable people to improve their lives. I thought you were concerned about getting yourself rich and your disgusting family, this dreadful family of yours. 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson warned, I'm sorry, for most of his career, Thomas Jefferson was an ideologue of the nascent slave power. Thomas Jefferson wanted a weak federal government that would be too weak to interfere with slavery. That's what he was interested in for most of his life. Then there is this late in life confession that Hamilton had been right all along. Instead of encouraging free and open debate, collectivists strive to discredit and intimidate opponents. They engage in character assassination. I should know. I'm the target. Saul Alinsky, blah, blah, blah. This is the antithesis of what we need. Or is he un-American? Does he want to rig the system? Yeah, he is un-American. The American way is a high standard of living, a high-wage economy. You believe, Koch, in a low-wage economy, which is a loser in today's world. Better learn Chinese. Write your next article in Chinese, because you'll become the viceroy of some Chinese regime here in the U.S. And then he's telling you how great the Koch industries are, how clean they are, and various other little points, creating real value for people, not for people, for your stupid shareholders, which means yourselves, because that's the way your company is held. Anyway, this is a self-righteous rant by Koch, and I think it would be a step forward for the Democratic Party. Certainly not adequate, certainly not programmatic, not what I want, but at least a step in the right direction to engage in a conflict with the Koch brothers, which could then, forces with greater mental clarity, could intervene in that and raise the level of class consciousness and make it programmatic. And I just would like to point to the Koch. Where did you get your money there, Charles Koch? Well, his father was this guy, Fred Koch, who basically had a procedure for catalytic cracking. Fine. He took that to the Soviet Union in 1929 to 1932 under Stalin in the initial phases of the 5-year plan. He later said, I didn't really like it, but he liked their money well enough. Then he became a big fan of Mussolini. The father of this guy was a great admirer of the Italian fascist dictator Mussolini. And, of course, he was a leading hater of Franklin D. Roosevelt, a hater of the New Deal, and a denier of the economic rights of the American people. That's Fred Koch. And he's also one of the founders of the John Birch Society. So we see from Ryan coming out of the John Birch machine in Wisconsin to Koch, the son of the founder of the John Birch Society, we can see what we're dealing with. And the other point is we can see that the money that Koch and Koch sank into libertarianism is coming back to help them. How would he defend himself? He says, I'm fighting for freedom. Freedom means I'm free to rape you, in effect, right? That's his freedom. He's talking about what used to be called not liberty, but license to abuse others, right? He's got the purview of freedom, and you have got the ability to simply undergo it, to be a rape victim at the hands of Koch. Now, he's this family. They're also the ones who put all the money into the Cato Institute, libertarianism. Remember that David Rockefeller brought over von Hayek to be his tutor, his ghostwriter, and von Mises to be a prof of some kind. So von Hayek and von Mises were the stooges of David Rockefeller to give him an ideology to defend his predatory antisocial practices, sociopathic practices. And with the Koch brothers, that was the Cato Institute, and then they got into a fight and they had to move on. Now, the American people want their economic rights. And if you have 7 million people who have signed up for Obamacare, I hope it means that some of them will live and not die and live to fight the fascist power of this Koch cartel. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. The demonization of the Koch brothers is richly deserved, and if properly catalyzed, can become a part of a growing class consciousness. But of course, the terms of the polemic must go far beyond those that have been broached by dingy Harry, and that is a point to intervene in. So, Obamacare. I am for Medicare for all. Simple. One paragraph. Remove the age 65 limit. Make Medicare for all available to anybody, anytime. $100 per person per month if you've got a job. If you don't, if you're destitute, if you're unemployed, then for free. Medicare. The reason we must develop a labor force for the 21st century. If you want to have a labor force for the 21st century, people have got to have many years of advanced training, advanced degrees. You sink all that training into somebody, you can't afford to have them die. They must live. They must be healthy. They must work. We'll worry about the retirement stuff when the time comes. But for now, the main thing is to increase the longevity to begin with so that you can compete in a high-tech, scientific, technological world economy of the type that we hope to have and which we must have if the world is to survive. So we've got to increase longevity and increase rates of health in the workforce of this population. So we must develop our workforce, and making some kind of health care available is important. It comes down to that existential moment. What do you do under this system if you're over 26 or you have no parents that are not in the picture anyway, and you're less than 65, you lose your job, you got a pre-existing condition. What did you do before Obamacare? You were in hell. Now with Obamacare, you can at least get some form of medical assistance. So in spite of the sabotage, in spite of that Georgia insurance commissioner who said that his goal was to obstruct and to sabotage Obamacare, all the fascist Republican governors who would not expand Medicaid. There's a big fight going on in Virginia right now. The fascist Freemasons of Richmond, the cradle of secessionism, are fighting against Terry McAuliffe, Governor McAuliffe. McAuliffe at least is trying to bring in Medicaid, the Medicaid expansion. These fascist Republicans say no. I think some of them they're earning their tickets to Nuremberg in some future reckoning, or certainly at a later reckoning, which nobody escapes. They will have to answer for this. So 10 million people covered. Look, Kentucky, happy as Kentucky, in the discomfiture of Little Rand, and everything Little Rand stands for has been repudiated by the population of the bluegrass state. Kentuckians have signed up for Obamacare, and the rate of uninsured people in Kentucky has gone down by 40%. So that's a big dent in the health crisis of Appalachia and the coal fields and poverty that has gone on for generations. So good. Now, once you've got 7 million through the exchanges and 10 million in there, you have now got a block. You've got a vested interest in exerting and demanding the economic rights of the American people. That becomes a political fact. So it's then necessary, if these predatory insurance companies dare to raise their rates next year, if they turn their backs on the American people, then the American people will promptly turn their backs on the insurance companies. They will be nationalized as part of the Medicare for all, which is what we actually need. Or they'll simply be left to wither on the vine, take their rotten derivatives and their golden parachutes and their parasitical executives with them into the land of Pan Am, TWA, and all the other ones that are no longer with us, right? Studebaker, Packard, and so forth. Let them succumb to that wonderful creative destruction which the Schumpeterians so lewdly celebrate in other contexts. So there we have all of this. Right now, the Congress is still considering the emergency unemployment benefits beyond 26 weeks. They're talking about one that goes back to January is retroactive, and it means by the time they pass it, it'll almost be expired. They want it retroactive to January, and it would therefore end in May. This is pathetic. Is this the class defense of the Democratic Party? This is terrible. And, of course, we do want the minimum wage increased, but not to $10.10. We want $15 an hour. That's a living wage in the United States today. Let me also remind you that one of the things that Ryan wants is to cut education. Ryan's education cuts in this budget that the Republicans are probably going to ram through the House today, $145 billion cuts in education. That I think on top of that, $90 billion in Pell Grants cut. Now that would solidify the class structure, the lack of social mobility here in the U.S. That would become a scandal. And Ryan wants you to start paying interest on your student loans immediately. As soon as you take out the loan, you start paying interest. You don't get the grace period, the surcease, until you graduate. With Ryan, you start paying right away. Now, if there's a Democratic Party at all, and I'm not sure, they will hammer mercilessly on these points, right? If you're Medicare, if you have Medicaid, if you're a student with a Pell Grant, and on and on and on. If you want to have a country, then you better defeat those fascist Republicans as they come in. Now, the mass strike. We have the mass strike. I've been talking about it, the mass strike of 2014, 2015. So here we are in the spring of 2014, and we're headed, therefore, towards the beginning of a spring, which is already going to show this. Now, the mind benders, NATO intelligence, NATO counterintelligence, and their counterinsurgency operations have prepared a dog and pony show for dupes and cretins, and it's called the Worldwide Wave of Action, the Global Spring. And it's launched by Anonymous. Who is Anonymous? Nobody knows. They're anonymous, but the hypothesis might be advanced that they're simply a cognitive infiltration tentacle of the Central Intelligence Agency, MI6, DGSC, BND, and so forth. Now, the point of this is we've got the corrupt and decadent and thoroughly discredited Russell Brand attempting to attach himself to this. Who else do we have? We've got Eminem. Poor Eminem hasn't been getting any play. We've got Ice Cube. We've got a guy called Korn, or something called Korn, and presumably the children of Korn, of the Korn, will be showing up. This is supposedly, what it is in reality is to essentially hijack anybody who's developing real political insight, real leadership skills, real programmatic ideas, and put them back to this stupid, generic, Oedipal, anarchist kind of nonsense. So look, this is worse than Occupy. I just want to point this out. Occupy at least had the idea, the 1%, the 99%. At one point during Occupy, that secret headquarters they had, the counterinsurgency headquarters, the Vancouver, British Columbia Adbusters Foundation, put out a call saying, let's have a day of struggle for the financial transfer tax, transaction tax, the Wall Street sales tax, the Robin Hood tax, whatever they called it. But now this has disappeared. There's nothing about war. There's nothing about class. There's nothing about oligarchy. There's nothing about depression, unemployment, or anything. And I'll tell you some of the fatuous slogans in just a minute. Dulcis in fundum. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now let's quickly get the profile of this idiotic counterinsurgency plan called the Worldwide Wave of Action, the Worldwide Wave of Dupes and cretins and brain-damaged anarchists, Oedipal personalities. And again, they've thrown out any content that Occupy Wall Street actually did develop, but they want to go out and move out and do it, right? The most primitive adolescent, sub-adolescent. Here are their slogans. Can you hear me wherever you are? We are coming into the new world, the glorious future. The solar planet has been given wings. On April 4th, a global spring begins. Moment of clarity, our time has come. Begin to form affinity groups and then do it. Affinity groups were the CIA, FBI strategy to begin breaking up SDS here in the United States in 1968. And then, of course, let's create a culture of transformation. Oh, my gosh. Again, nothing about the world economic depression, nothing about Ukraine, nothing about Syria. And here's what they say. We are a leaderless movement. Why are you a leaderless movement? You never developed any leaders? What about these characters, such as they were in 2011 there at Zuccotti Park? We are a leaderless movement. We do our own thing. Oh, my God. I am me. We want a new paradigm. Joe Sixpack now wants to know, what's a paradigm? But that paradigm is not clearly identified, nor is it coupled with concrete proposals. So 3 years later, still no program, no demands, no nothing. And they want Martin Luther King and Charlie Chaplin. The decentralized movement towards freedom is raging across the world. And now for 3 months, we're going to have these lunatics. They say they're the cool thing to do. They're where it's at. They're the global spring. And it's all brought to you courtesy of Anonymous. Well, the beauty of Anonymous is any intelligence agency that decides to call itself Anonymous can come out. But the one thing we do know is that Anonymous is supporting the fascists in Ukraine. They love right sector. They love Svoboda. They don't like Yanukovych. You get the idea. It's anti-Russian. It's a desire to project that into the Russian Federation. Now, it will fail. So it's springtime. The birds are singing. The brook is babbling, and the saps are running to the worldwide wave of action with their new paradigm, courtesy of Eminem. Of course, the idea is the color revolution is what? The color revolution is you want to destroy a society, you're not strong enough or you don't dare to attack them with military means, so you wish to induce them to destroy themselves. How do you induce a society to destroy itself? You appeal to the Oedipal, infantile, cretinous impulses of youth in the springtime and launch something like this. So I urge people to stay away from this. This is so smelly. This is much worse than the original Occupy. And of course, when you got these smelly characters like Russell Brand around there, that is really bad. Now, a programmatic point. I don't think we're going to get to much Wheeler Bennett on Ukraine today. I wanted to do. We do have to watch out. Just one thing, right? Obama was in Saudi Arabia. And according to our dear friend David Ignatius of the Washington Post, out of this, it is likely that the U.S. is going to escalate the arming of the terrorist death squads in Syria. This is Sunday, March 30th here in the Washington Post. The U.S. would be training the Free Syrian Army to combat al-Qaeda and to try to sift them out. But the centerpiece is this. 5 man pads, 5 shoulder-launched missile launchers would be videoed. They would have a tracking device. They would have a remote shutdown mechanism. This is Ben Rhodes, right, the little enemy of civilization in the White House there. This is the guy who tried to do the television coup in Syria in July of 2012. It failed, but he's coming back on Syria. And Obama still has concerns about man pads falling into the wrong hands. 5 missile launchers are going to be given to the terrorists of the Free Syrian Army. Well, Obama, you want to get impeached? You want to be hung out to dry? You want to be twisting in the wind? Just go ahead and do this. 5 man pads How about an Israeli airliner? How about a Turkish airliner? How about, well, you can go on from there, right? Anybody who goes over the Eastern Mediterranean is going to be a sitting duck for those man pads. And when the Malaysian airliner is going to turn out to be a picnic compared to the monstrous consequences of giving those missile launchers to terrorists in Syria. And once they go in, believe me, you can't control them. And your allies, the Free Syrian Army, those are the wimps. The Nusra brigades, the ISIS, the Islamic Front, they're the ones who are going to get them. And Obama, once they put them into action against perhaps the Israelis, that's the end of you. You're going to have you're going to be crucified on television every day because it'll be the Malaysian airliner to the 10th power, and you're going to be responsible. So don't do it. And by the way, we don't want to placate or ingratiate ourselves with these Saudi monsters. And there, I would also say concerning this Palestinian-Israeli negotiation with Kerry, no freedom for Jonathan Pollard except a final status agreement, which includes the ending of all the Israeli settlements, the creation of an independent Palestinian state, fully sovereign, with a Marshall Plan from Europe, the U.S., and China to rebuild the entire area. And it includes the Israelis. Yes, it does. The entire area has got to be rebuilt. If you want to put Pollard on the top of that as a cherry on the cake, that's fine. But not, at this point, no. It means the final status agreement of everything, and they need a piece of Jerusalem, as we know, and all of that has got to be finessed. But now, we have two interesting things. One is a book called Flash Boys. We've got a book about high-frequency trading, and it's highly relevant, right? We're very much against high-frequency trading. We're coming up to the 4th anniversary of the flash crash of May 2010, which was, as you remember, a machine, an infernal machine of derivatives, which was designed to destroy the euro, and it began to destroy the euro compared to the yen, but then it also destroyed the Dow Jones averages, and that was the flash crash. So this is called Flash Boys by Michael Lewis, and we've got all sorts of traders telling you what to do. The only answer to this is the 1% Wall Street sales tax. 1% Wall Street sales tax on all stocks, bonds, derivatives, and any other transaction. And that's the only way to do it. And I have to say, I think we had Ralph Nader interviewed on one of the cable news programs, and he did have the decency to say in the telephone interview that it would take a financial transaction tax or speculation tax, as he called it, is the only way to suppress high-frequency trading, flash trading, and these exotic forms of program trading. Now, an interesting theoretical issue, in addition to this Flash Boys, and by the way, Flash Boys is coordinated, as so often happens, with the FBI. The FBI is opening and here we have it in the Wall Street Journal of April 1st. Wall Street Journal, FBI investigates high-speed traders. Probe in the early stages focuses on whether companies are taking advantage of inside information. Well, of course they are, and they've got to be taxed out of existence, and some of this stuff can also be banned. But tax is easier to enforce. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. What I want to discuss, though, and we'll discuss next time, is this book called Capital by Thomas Piketty. Let's call it Piketty's Charge. Piketty's charge is that historically the real productivity of an economy grows at 1.1 to 1.5%, but the average return on property titles, on investment claims, is between 4 and 5%. So that's a recipe for crisis. Well, Piketty, it's much worse because you're assuming that racism and anti-Semitism and racism and Sturmabteilung, right, the brown shirts of the Musichko type, the right sector group, but also Svoboda, and everything that they represent culturally and politically. This must be nipped in the bud. Ukrainian fascism must be strangled in the cradle. Principiis obsta, right? Während den Anfängen. That was the sad lesson for Germany after the seizure of power in 1933. You've got to nip this in the bud, because all of a sudden, like the September 1930 elections in Germany, right? The Nazis went from being kind of a nuisance and a curiosity to being a real threat to seize power. So we want the Ukrainian fascists crushed, quite simply, right? We want them to be deprived of the ability to influence world affairs. We don't want the ability to unleash World War III in the hands of some lunatic of the Chanibok Yarosh model. And I mentioned them as the head of Svoboda and the head of the right sector, respectively. We cannot have these people affecting and impacting the destiny of the world. And then, just to make this accounting a little bit simpler than it might be, a third point is the one that's posed to every individual, and that is to say the human qualities, the moral and intellectual qualities of the U.S. ruling elite, and how degenerate they are, and how decadent they are, and how hysterical, and how they are the ones who have turned their backs on reality as a matter of philosophical method, right? Remember, they are in the Nietzschean Schopenhauer realm. They believe in the world as will and imagination. You make your own world by your own purely gratuitous and heteronomic or existential actions. Take, for example, we compare Obama and Putin, and we see who is morally and intellectually superior. I don't think there's any doubt. Again, I'm not in the business of demonizing Obama. I tried to warn against Obama when there was time to prevent him from being inflicted on the world. But now that train has left the station, and at the moment, in the face of the Romney forces, the madmen of the type of the neocons, the Kagans, these characters, the worst possible tendencies of the U.S. ruling class have come to the fore. They have been elicited. They have been evoked by this unipolar situation. I don't know anybody in the world that would have done better if you had the Chinese elite, or for that matter, the Russian elite, or German, or whatever, Japanese, it doesn't matter, Brazil. Any elite put in this unipolar position is going to witness its own worst tendencies become dominant, or at least strive and contend for domination. But in the case of the United States, concretely, what we've lived through now in the past quarter century is that without the counterbalancing force of the USSR, and with Russia in a position of weakness and having lost the initiative, the worst tendencies have come out in the U.S. And these are the neocons, on the one hand, the right-wing warmongers, the pro-Israeli faction of the United States, but not only that, right, the ones who want to follow the Nazi recipe, really, of Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, that conflict is needed, the Nietzschean recipe, I guess you'd say, the Nietzschean Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss faction here in the United States, wishing to organize everything around enemy image, Feindbild, and therefore to run this society on an oligarchical basis using the pretext of this foreign enemy. And we've also had on the other side the left warmongers. We've seen them more clearly in the past couple of years since Obama came in. As I warned, the left warmongers for Obama, the way they see it, the human rights people, the humanitarian interventionists, the lunatics like Samantha Power, the loopy crackpot speaking for the United States at the United Nations. These two mentally deranged groups in their own geopolitical estimations, right? You got the neocons and then the the responsibility to protect people, the R2P group. Between them, we see that the worst tendencies of the entire ideological spectrum come to the fore. What is needed is the traditional recipe, the balance of power, a counterweight. Who can provide the counterweight? Who has the political maturity, a certain amount of economic power, a certain amount of economic independence, a certain amount of cultural tradition? It's Russia. It's the unconquered country, right? Remember, the unconquered countries, the ones who have not been overrun in the last 1,000 years or so, or, well, not quite 1,000 years, but let's say 500 years, or thereabouts anyway. It gets you down to the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. These are special countries in that regard. We need the power of Russia to be revived. A strong Russia is a great help for a striking worker in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with what you hear about on the radio here at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net, and that includes this article on the minimal, feeble basis of Ukrainian nationality. The fact that Ukraine is a puppet state set up by the German General Staff, by Field Marshal von Hindenburg and General Ludendorff during World War I for the purposes of getting food. It is the delicatessen of the German General Staff, the supermarket of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, a supermarket chain, 1 million tons of grain, 400 million eggs, 50,000 tons of beef, and so forth. This was the price of recognition of the Ukrainian Rada, February 1918. Now, getting back to the Putin question, first of all, the need to balance the United States, to suppress and to muffle these awful atavistic tendencies. In other words, the atavism is here. The neocons have essentially shaken the foundations of the modern world, and then they're joined by the responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention, cement the power crackpots. The benchmark is the United Nations Charter. Interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states is inadmissible. Force and the threat of force are inadmissible. And then we had the Non-Proliferation Treaty. United States nuclear state cannot, under the nuclear non-proliferation, go around threatening non-nuclear states. Once you do that, you've knocked the entire world out of kilter. So Putin is the sole effective antidote to that. We need Putin to remain resolute because this suppresses these awful heteronomic and catastrophic tendencies of the U.S. Now, a second point is in the very specifics of the Ukrainian situation. We do not want a rebirth of fascism. Speaking of atavisms, the return of fascism and Nazism. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. The Ukrainian crisis rolls on. I will direct, if I may, your kind attention to my website, Tarpley.net, where by the time you hear this broadcast, we will have posted a major essay by me on the history of Ukraine. I'll try to give you some more samples of that towards the end of this program, if we can eke out the time from the busy world theater going on around us. But the principal insights that would be added to what we already had last week come from John Wheeler Bennett, British agent, in some ways the central figure of the network that produced Henry Kissinger later on. But his book, The Forgotten Peace, Brest-Litovsk, 1918, a discussion of what was actually going on in Eastern Europe, European Russia, during 1918, 1919, the time when we had the first appearance of Ukraine, the first time Ukraine ever got on the map, the first time that Ukraine, during 19 19 was self-governing. And, of course, we had pogroms. We had this Simon Petliura starting with his massacres of Jews and others, but also Poles, and tremendous hostility to Russians. So do take a look. In the past week, we've been hearing again this idiotic, imbecilic mantra of NATO and U.S. propaganda. There are no fascists in Ukraine. There are no fascists in the Ukrainian government. We heard that again this morning on National Public Radio on the Diane Rehm weekly international hour. No fascists? Well, right sector would beg to differ. Those right sector fascists, neo-Nazis or Nazis, paleo-Nazis, some of them, they are in a furor after the killing of the Nazi thug Muzichko, or Muzichka, and what they had this past weekend and into this week, the Kiev Rada, the parliament, self-styled, was surrounded by fascist gangs attempting to impose the ouster of the interior minister, blamed by the right sector, by Yarosh and his gang, for having killed their man Muzichka. So we had those fascists on parade. They were all over the place. They were holding the parliament at gunpoint, as they did finally in the late months of Yanukovych. Although this time there are no police left. There's no Berkut. There's nothing left to try to stop them. So there are plenty of fascists. No threats? Well, there are no threats to the Russian minority or the Russian population of eastern Ukraine. Why do we have Timoshenko, the kleptocratic gas princess and darling of NATO and great friend of Merkel? Why is Timoshenko threatening to use nuclear weapons for genocide and ethnic cleansing against the Russians of East Ukraine? How can that be? And not a word about it, of course, from the NATO media. So there's plenty wrong. I would urge the following. Rather than go down the path of the warmongers, as we heard on National Public Radio this morning, National Pentagon Radio, with the BBC, interestingly, the British have come into their own, right? That hostility, that implacable conflict between the Russian Empire and the British Empire in the 19th century is still alive culturally. It's a tropism. It's a Pavlovian reaction. I would propose to anybody of goodwill in the world, and in particular to people in the United States who can influence to some degree the political events here, you need to support, in a general sense, what Putin is doing. It doesn't mean you have to support every piece of idiocy that comes out of the mouth of some dubious character on some allegedly Russian television network. No, you don't have to support every piece of imbecility from Abby Martin. It doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that the general nature of the project is beneficial for the world. What are the benefits of Putin in the general sense? First of all, we have seen since 1991 that the unipolar world is not viable. It's not workable. This is not ideology. This is simply a practical observation. The problem is that the ruling elite of the United States lacks the necessary wisdom. There was some wisdom during the Cold War. It was induced by big, dirty Soviet ICBMs and H-bombs. But since that threat has receded, at least in the minds of